The $1 million benchmark that early stage companies and a lot of companies and even personal perspectives usually lands on. Everyone, wants to make their first million, wants to raise that first million, wants to hit the $1 million mark. Is a funny number, and in the past few weeks I've been dealing with that $1 million number in a lot of investment conversations. Some of them very early stage, some of them operating business. I mentioned yesterday I was meeting with Phil at Game Time Technologies, and where that $1 million can be a lot of money and not a lot of money at the same time. It can be really unique depending on, there's the obvious. $1 million to someone who's never had $1 million before is a lot of money. $1 million to someone who's a multi-millionaire or billionaire is obviously not a lot at all. That's the obvious. And it works in terms of the business structure as well. $1 million to a company who has never made $1 million is a lot of money. $1 million to a company who has $1 million in revenue, or nearing $1 million in revenue, is not a lot of money. And you almost have to argue whether or not is $1 million enough for some people. And the other side of the coin is the $1 million too much for some companies. What it really comes down to, and what a lot of earlier stage companies have to understand, is $1 million for an idea and potential is a lot of money. More money than most people will ever make in their lifetime. But $1 million for a company doing $500,000 in revenue per year, that's not a lot of money. That amount of money doesn't get you very far either if you're high growth company. So that, and I understand where people get that that dollar in mind. It is a very unique number to hit for anything, whether it's dollars, revenue, sales, inventory, followers, whatever it may be. $1 million is a very unique number and a very enticing number. But what we always have to land on when we're talking about investment opportunities, and especially we mostly deal with venture capital as our lead investors in an ideal situation. $1 million is not a lot of money for venture capital. It is almost too early, but a lot of those venture capital companies like to get involved early enough, especially if there's revenue, if there's traction, they think there's an opportunity for it to grow. And what happens in a lot of cases, so a revenue generating company, let's say, like for example Game Time, $1 million is just basically a bridge to the next round. So can $1 million get you the growth that you need to get to a point where you're raising $3 million or $5 million in the near future? That's where a revenue generating company raising $1 million, that's the ideal situation. In a high growth situation, unless your revenue is not there and $1 million is still sort of pre-revenue. But it still goes back to, if you've never had $1 million in your sight, $1 million is a lot of money. And I mean that personally, and I mean that in an early stage business. You will still be hard pressed, no matter how good your business is, to raise $1 million pre-revenue, unless you've created something extremely unique, which maybe you'll have less of an issue raising $1 million. But if you have $1 million target in sight or already hit, raising $1 million should be no issue, because even if you had to finance it, don't go the outside investment avenue, at least you have traction and you can use numbers and projections and actual tangible results to raise $1 million. So early stage companies, keep that in mind. If if you have $1 million in your sight, and I don't mean mathematical projections, obviously that's great, but being realistic and strategic about how you raise that money, you might be able to get to $1 million much easier. And maybe you skip over the $1 million. Maybe you take $250,000 and it gets you to a point where your next fundraise is $3 million. I would honestly say that that's a better situation than trying to raise $1 million out the gate and potentially ruining the next round. So use the personal mindset of $1 million being a lot of money when raising your first round or an early stage round. If you've never seen it, and if $1 million is not in sight, maybe you need to scale back the initial raise and be realistic. But if you've got revenue targets that you could easily hit in the near future, either $1 million is a good bridge, or maybe it's not enough.